Well, good afternoon, everyone. Today, you have me, yours truly, of course. And the session is in a slightly different format from what you normally have. Right now, probably, in a dissertation lecture. So, for the first hour of the session, you've got a virtual lecture, and for the latter 2 hours, so second and third hour, you'll have me for the rest of the session live. So I'll head straight over digitally to see you all. So for the first hour, there's a task that we would have done anyway. So it does make a great deal of difference that I'm not there, because when we meet up for the second and third hours of the lecture, we're going to start off by looking at your responses for that task. Now, the task itself, I'll give you an overview of the session in a moment, but the task itself is all focused around identifying how you can best position yourself during and after your degree, especially in this climate, so that you stand the best chance of success. Now, some of you may know you won't have. So the undergraduate students, and I'll also share this with you now. So you guys will hear on the media how there's a lot of concern out there about jobs and how uncertain these times are. What you need to do, and what we all need to do, is adapt, and to be able to adapt. And by sheer fortune, you guys and me and my colleagues and anybody with specialist knowledge of exercise, anything related to exercise, currently and in the future, are going to be in a really strong position. So I'll explain that in more detail in the lecture, of course. So this session is entitled Sport and Exercise Sciences, the Past, the Present, but what about the future? And what about the future? As I mentioned just in the last bit of footage, how can you position yourself well for the future? Well, think about these statistics first of all. Every year, we know that 5 million people die unnecessarily, simply due to the fact that they are not active enough to maintain adequate health. So this is independent of diet, how much sleep they get, stress levels. There's been very large epidemiological studies carried out which statistically separate out the effects of diet and other things like alcohol and smoking, that, you know, they're big sort of lifestyle factors. And when we take the effects of physical inactivity alone, so that's defined as not meeting government guidelines, then 5 million people die as a result of having inadequate levels of physical activity. That's a lot of people. What it equates to put it into something meaningful, that's 9 people per minute. Just because mainly in the rich countries of the world, we don't move enough. So per minute, about 9 people, and obviously per second, that's over 1 individual per second. So one now, one now, one now, one now. Another sad statistic is 1/3 of people are not active enough to maintain good health. So there, we're not talking about going to the gym. We're not talking about carrying out structured more vigorous exercise. We're talking about human movement. So the movement that it takes to walk somewhere, to carry out what you would call activities of daily living, essential activities. And it's really easy to do that because one thing is the amount of technology we have around us. Another thing is the amount of sort of mechanical oriented devices we have around us, labor saving devices. So in today's session, we're going to do 3 things. So firstly, we're going to take a brief look at the history of exercise and exercise research to give us the correct context for the present and also the future. So we'll have a little chat, or rather I'll give a little kind of delivery on that. And then, so that'll be about 20 minutes. And then for the remainder of the first hour of the session, I'll show you the task that I'd like you to work on. It's really useful. It's a task that's carried out by CEOs of, FTSE 100 companies, the biggest 100 companies in the UK. Very successful individuals commonly carry out this test, and it comes from the field of clinical psychology, actually. So more about that in a second. When I join you at the hour mark, we'll start to look at the present, and we'll focus on what you put down for the task, so identifying strengths and weaknesses. So take note, I'm not going to ask you to share any of your personal strengths or weaknesses. It's an exercise that the idea is that you learn to do it and do it regularly, because if you do it regularly, then it keeps you on the right path and it keeps you moving, stops you from procrastinating and putting things off. So we'll focus on that when we start the live 2 hours of the session. So we'll focus on knowledge gaps in the evidence at the moment and current innovations that are taking place, and that'll take us to the future. Now, the future is speaking to a lot of students, and I guess that you guys will be the same. The future is something that a lot of us are maybe feel a little uncertain about. So for the last third of the session, I want to talk a little bit about the future, because there's a lot of research on the future of exercise research and how it links to things like healthcare, and how that link is going to become stronger, and how there's going to be a rapidly increasing need for people specializing in with any kind of exercise expertise. So we'll focus on the first point there. Quick look at the history of exercise. Just a quick one, because it's not a history lesson, of course. So the notion that exercise is linked to health or has an effect on the physiology of the body and the psychology of the body, of course, that's nothing new. So that idea dates back to kind of ancient China, a bit earlier than that, actually. That's found in the history books, as it were. If you think about ancient Greek society, there was a structured exercise regime where you had the ancient Olympic Games. That was carried out for entertainment, just in the same way we have the modern Olympic Games, and the athletes who took part in those games normally, unlike Roman times where there were slaves, in ancient Greek society were normally more affluent individuals who could afford to be athletes. Now, if you go onto Canvas, you can have a quick look at this infographic I created for you. It just summarizes the history of sport and exercise sciences from where we are at the moment during ancient Greek times to something called the technology revolution. Now, what is that? We will find out in a moment. So even back when we didn't have, in ancient Greek times, we didn't have scientists as such. The people who acquired new knowledge were philosophers. So scientists tend to think of that job as being exclusively carried out by philosophers. Hippocrates was a philosopher stroke scientist who did a lot of work or thinking in medicine and about the body and how the body works. And he came out with this quote, bearing in mind how long ago this is. So he said, all parts of the body have a function. If used in moderation, they become healthy and age more slowly. But if left unused, they become liable to disease and infection. And he was pretty accurate, as it turns out, as we know today. And that's probably one of the reasons why, if you do a medical degree, you've got to stand up and swear a Hippocratic oath, which is basically your promise to do no harm. So, important figure there. So, a little task just to look at the history of sport and exercise science on that infographic that I showed you. Now, during those times, so during, obviously we've got, there's just an image from a film here, 300. So we've got the Spartans there, and these are actual pictures from where the ancient Olympic Games took place. This is where the athletes would have come out to compete. And there you've got what's left of the area where they would compete. Obviously a limited number of sports. You had the marathon, which I've got on the next slide. Marathon, throwing based sports like the shot put, and also a lot of kind of combat sports, similar to what you would see in what we call MMA today. Was a sport called pancration, which is a type of wrestling, and that still exists today. Fast forward to Roman times, well, things were a little bit different. So you can see the Colosseum here. Exercise was used in sociology circles. It's said to be used as an opiate for the masses. Now, when I see you in the live session, I'm going to be asking you what that means. You've probably heard of that phrase before, but we'll see what you think that means. An opiate for the masses. Think what an opiate is. It's a painkiller. Now, if we fast forward quite a few years, so we're missing out the Middle Ages and a few important periods in time. Fast forward to a period of time where we had the Industrial Revolution. So things changed quite drastically, and we had a lot of manufacturing taking place. And yes, that is a child. No health and safety back then. But yeah, a lot of factories. So even as early as the 1800s, we had the invention of labour-saving devices. Fast forward again, by 1843, there was a professor at King's College London called, it was William Guy. He reported that he just observed, so he didn't carry out any kind of study, but he observed just within society that there seemed to be more degenerative diseases amongst men with jobs that required less physical activity or less exercise. And those at universities, researchers and academics and so on, continued to observe this pattern, this trend. Now, by the 1950s, there was a really prominent professor called Jerry Morris, and he noticed that men returning from World War II, those who went into jobs where there was a lot of physical activity involved, tended to reintegrate into society a lot better and more successfully, compared to men who went into relatively sedentary jobs where there wasn't a lot of physical activity required. He found that they integrated back into society far less successfully, and also, just anecdotally, because no science was conducted yet, he noticed that they didn't seem to live as long. So this captured Professor Morris's imagination, and so what he did was he headed down to London and he carried out a really, really simple but important and really effective experiment. So he went down to London and he recruited a load of bus drivers and a load of bus conductors. Major difference between those two groups is that the bus drivers, they were seated all day, so by definition they were sedentary. Whereas the bus conductors, they were walking up and down the stairs all day, walking around the bus, standing. Certainly a very active job. Obviously we don't have bus conductors anymore, but yeah, so I had those two very different job types. So we'll see what the findings of that study are in a second. But what a lot of people don't realize is that right now we're undergoing another revolution, just like the Industrial Revolution. At the moment, or since around 2010, we've been experiencing what we call the technology revolution. So think about it. We had the internet. Think how fast the internet has expanded and how you can really do anything on the internet. And that's not too much of a stretch in terminology. Right now we can see big business kind of taking over, the high street, like Amazon, eBay, Microsoft. Yeah. We've got the introduction of artificial intelligence, which in the future will replace a lot of human jobs. But in the third half of this, the third of this session, I'm going to explain why that's an advantage if you plan properly. The next for example, evidence of that, the next focus of Apple for quite a number of years. So when I was doing my PhD, my PhD supervisor worked quite closely with Apple. Very, he was a guy with a lot of good links. And he mentioned that they were going to make healthcare their exclusive focus. And what do you know, they've just announced that. So I'll show you a little bit of footage of Apple doing so. But back to Professor Morris and his bus drivers and bus conductors. I think if I've taught you before, you'll have seen this slide before. So bus drivers versus bus conductors, sedentary versus active. What were the differences? So he measured just the number, so not the risk, just the number of people who had a heart attack. So myocardial infarction. And the findings were pretty remarkable. So Morris found that the drivers who had a high sit time were far more sedentary, had nearly 2.5 times the risk of having a heart attack, 2.5 times the relative incidence, which just means the number, pardon me, compared to the conductors. a huge difference. So because of the magnitude of that difference, his findings were challenged, and they were challenged quite rigorously. Firstly by the unions, because obviously they weren't happy, showing that their employees are suffering. So a lot of alternative explanations were come up with, and that's the basis of science, of course. Do the bus drivers smoke more? Do they carry out less activity in their leisure time? So Morris replicated his findings in a lot of other groups. So postal workers, office workers, he went into the civil service, and really published a lot of studies that showed very robust findings. And there's one study called the Whitehall study. It's now called the Whitehall 2 study. It started in the 70s and it continues to this very day. And it's one of the few long-term studies which exercise or physical activity is one of the major focus. So since that first study, over the last few decades, there's been an explosion in the number of studies that have been published and have demonstrated that low levels of physical activity increase the risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, certain cancers, so cancers of the bowel and breast, hypertension, all the chronic conditions that were previously thought to be due just to old age. We now know that these conditions are fundamentally preventable. So with that in mind, a little chat about the history of exercise research. What I'd like you to do now is a task, and I'll show you where to find it and what to do. So if you sign into Canvas and go to this module, obviously, you'll notice on the left hand side here we have quizzes. So I'm in student view, so this is what you should basically see. Now if you click on quizzes, you'll see a quiz. Surprise, surprise. Click on the quiz, so it's entitled Self-Reflection, and there's a little introduction there from me. Tells you what the quiz is about. There's only 4 questions, but the questions that require you to reflect on basically on what's brought you to this point in time, this moment, doing what you're doing. So really focuses on 2 things: identifying factors that are common to people who tend to achieve success in their field, success being obviously defined by you in terms of what brings fulfillment to your life. And number 2, to identify key aspects of your personality and also kind of behavioral choices about the past, strengths, things that you feel you could have done differently. And that's why I'm not, obviously, I'm keeping this all confidential. So all you do is, so I'll make sure I'm in student view there. So you should see something like this. So you click on the right quiz and then just click take the quiz. So they're essay questions, just 4 of them, but they do require reflection. That's the whole kind of point. So a little explanation at the start there, and then question 1, it explains a certain type of kind of aspect of personality. And then you've got areas to answer your question at the bottom there. And then question number 2, again, just focuses on other areas of personality, which obviously we're going to expand on this and explain it during the live part of the session. Question number 3 focuses on personality traits. What you think your personality traits are. So I've asked you to choose 5 and just note them down, keep them confidential. Obviously you're working remotely, so you're probably at home. 5 personality traits and 5 examples when you've showed these traits. And I would keep it sort of limited to university. I certainly don't go delving into anything personal that's happened in life. And then question 4 just looks at areas that we could all potentially improve on. Now, all we've got to do is identify the answers. Don't think about it too much, because what we're going to do is when I join you in the live second and third parts of the session, I'm just generically going to go through success factors in, well, I was going to say exercise science, but in life that can be applied to any areas of career or professional life. So if you could do that task, and by the time you finish that, I shall be back with you to join you for the live latter part of the session. So over to you.